People always talk about marketing week and building week as if like those are the only two things that matter. But like you should think about doing good research as just as important.
Hello and welcome back to Indie Bites, the podcast where I bring you stories of fellow indie hackers in 15 minutes or less. Today is a very special episode because it marks 100 episodes of Indie Bites. And to mark that occasion, I'm bringing back my very first guest, Charlie Ward, founder of Ramen Club, to talk about how he's grown his community into the core of the London indie scene while scaling at its peak to 7k MRR. Charlie has also been a long-time supporter of the show, having sponsored well over 30 episodes and taken a bet on me early on. But before we get into this conversation, I want to thank the Indie Bite sponsor, Email Octopus. Funnily enough, I actually met the founders through Charlie's community, Indie London, so let me tell you a bit about them. Email Octopus are an indie email marketing platform built to support other small growing businesses like yours. They're focused on affordability and ease of use, which is perfect when you're starting out as a bootstrapper. Email Octopus contains all of the features you need to reach and grow your audience, and you can start today without paying a penny on their free plan, where you can contact up to 2,500 subscribers. To try out Email Octopus, head to emailoctopus.com or hit the link in the show notes. Charlie, welcome back to the pod. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, James. It's an honour to be invited back.
I can't believe it's been 100 episodes and however many years, 3 years since I started the pod.
Yeah.
I think it's fundamentally changed my life in the sense that I wouldn't have met the people that I've met through the podcast, and I wouldn't have started the podcast had I not had the encouragement of the Ramen Club community. And I think that's the case with a lot of Ramen Club members. Do you sort of feel that as well? Have you seen that where other people wouldn't have started their things without the community you started?
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure. You know, I'm sure that some people may have still gone on to do certain things.
Who do you think's been the most successful person that's come from Ramen Club or company or group of people?
Well, if you just look at it in terms of, say, how large the business has grown, you have to say Veed, because Saba was in the Ramen Club Slack like back in 2019 or something like that. And that's when they were on like a few K MRR. And we first met Saba and Tim when they came to Indie Beers, and they didn't have revenue, I think, at that point, which is insane. And now, you know, they've raised a Series A, they're growing really fast. And, you know, there's lots of other examples of people that have gone on to success, like seeing you and Indie Bites, of course, Data Fetcher, for example, with Andy Cloak, Tiny Hosts with Elston Barreto, just lots of people. You know, we have like 4 different members are in a tiny seed cohort right now. Considering there's like 130 people, that's a pretty good hit rate.
That's interesting that some members have also gone on to raise from tiny seed. Some people have gone on to raise funding. We will loop back to this at the end because I want to get your thoughts on what being an indie hacker is now. But on our first episode we recorded, Charlie, the company that you were running was called Weekend Club, and you've since rebranded it to Ramen Club. What prompted the change in brand for you?
Weekend Club came about when I was at Indie Beers with Will Klopp, who runs Simple Poll. We just discussed like it'd be cool if people could kind of co-work together, like occasionally on like a Saturday or something. Over the years, it evolved, and you know there were people who were basically full time on their projects, and it just didn't make sense just to call it Weekend Club, because we also had people who didn't join because they're like, "Oh, I don't want to co-work on the weekend. I want to hang out during the week or something like that." So we just thought that the name was slightly redundant, and I was just thinking for a while about, okay, what should it be called, and like what is the community about? And a lot of the people who join the community are not all, but a lot are just starting out. And the kind of goal that unites a lot of people is this thing around ramen profitability, or being ramen profitable. Paul Graham describes that as ramen profitable means a startup makes just enough to pay the founder's living expenses. And, you know, you can argue about what just enough means. For some people, that's still living a life of luxury. For some people, that literally is like living off ramen noodles, living on someone's sofa or something like that. My interpretation is it means sort of the lower end, but you basically, the power of it is you don't need a job and you don't need outside funding or anything like that. So I thought this is like a nice kind of shared goal a lot of people have when joining to get to the point of freedom. And it doesn't mean it's the end goal. You know, you don't want to necessarily live like that forever, but it's a point where you can really dedicate yourself to your products, your startup, your idea, and really take it where you want to take it. So I just thought it made a lot of sense.
So you've learned a lot about building community over the years. If people want to sort of replicate this or build their own community for their niche, what advice would you give them if they're starting out?
First of all, I would just do a little bit of reading before you start. So I would just read a book called Get Together by Bailey Richardson. It's very short. It's like a very good primer on starting communities. Also, Rosie Sherry, who was the head of community at Indie Hackers, has a really good blog and community called Rosieland. But generally speaking, I think people kind of move too quickly to like, oh, let's start a Slack or let's start a Discord. Generally, what I've recommended to people is just start with a group chat. So just start with a highly curated, say 10, 20 people, like WhatsApp or Telegram or iMessage. Have a clear idea before you start, okay, what is the purpose of this community and who it's for? Make it free at the beginning. And you want to get to a stage where your group chat is basically kind of exploding. So it's like too much to handle and people are inviting other people and that sort of thing. And then you're like, oh, wow, we need to move to something a bit more sophisticated. Think of some good regular rituals. So rituals are basically like the equivalent of features in communities. They're like regular things that you do to make people progress towards the purpose of your community. So, in like a maker community, a common ritual is you say, hey, well, what's everyone working on this week? It seems like common sense, but I would just start very simply with a group chat and go from there.
Charlie, you are like in this community with a lot of early founders and a lot of successful founders. You've seen people sort of go through the whole process. By osmosis, you must get a lot of growth stories, tactics, advice. What are some advice you would give to founders in terms of starting, validating, and then growing their products?
There's always an exception to every rule, but generally speaking, by all means, like experiment with a few ideas, see what's working, what's not working, try different things out. But the people I've seen with the most success, when they find something that does seem to get more natural traction, they tend to double down on that and work on that for like a couple of years before they're getting to like enough to be able to completely survive off it. If you work on 2 startups at the same time, some people may have had success with that, but for most people, it probably reduces your chance of either of those being really successful. And it's fun working on multiple things. Like the kind of people that get into being founders, a lot of people are very curious and creative, but it's just like if doing what's most fun is one thing, but doing what's most likely to give you a life-changing outcome is sometimes a different thing.
It depends on your goals as well. What I've learned from this podcast and speaking to people in Ramen Club, that it's up to you how you spend your indie life and your time and what you want to do, what goals you have. When I spoke to Rob Walling, he was talking about a lot of indie founders want permanent freedom. That when I spoke to Ramen Club member Michael Christofides, he said that he's quite happy growing slowly and doing things at the pace that works for him because he quite enjoys the safety net of his contracting and he wants to carry on doing that for a while. And so people have different viewpoints, they've got different goals, so there's no one right answer. But if you do want to get to success and that permanent freedom, portfolio projects harder to do.
I believe so. And you're right. Part of the reason people go into this sort of world rather than a VC backed world is so they have a bit more control over their destiny and their day to day. So in terms of other stuff that I've learned from just, working with people in this community, aside from people kind of tending, after experimenting, to focus on one thing, they also are very focused with their marketing channel. So Richa Prasad, for example, who runs Coach Viva, she says they spend at least 80% of their effort just on YouTube, and they've done that for years and years. And it means they're great at YouTube rather than they're not okay at 5 channels. They're great at YouTube, and then they have a couple of other things they focus on. And I've seen this, people pick something. It can be SEO, it can be YouTube, it can be cold outreach. I've seen all of them work, and other things besides that. Something else I think is interesting is just on the types of ideas that work. So they tend to go for competitive markets, but they kind of execute it in a slightly novel way. So you have Tiny Host. You take a huge industry that exists already, which is web hosting, and you might look at DigitalOcean and think, oh, wow, I can't just create another DigitalOcean. But what Tiny Host did was they just made it far more accessible and cheaper. And they just made a really easy sort of free plan. So at one point, I don't think you even had to create an account to host something, so they just made it really easy. So big market, but in a novel kind of execution. Or you had, say, Data Fetcher by Andy Cloak, which lets you run API requests from an Airtable base. He noticed that this existed for Google Sheets. And he was like, where else could this work? Oh, this doesn't exist on Airtable. And I think if you just take that sort of one idea of like, okay, what works in this market? Could I just do this in a different market? Let's say a successful Chrome extension. Could you just make this an extension for Firefox? There's actually like so many different things you can build just with this idea. And it's basically pre-validated. And I think more people should be doing this, especially if it's like their first kind of idea. It's still creative to me. This is still valuable. I think sometimes people try to be too creative with what they're trying to build, especially I think if you're building something venture-backed, it kind of should be something that's like novel and really difficult to achieve and like you've never seen before. But in the bootstrap world, I think you may want to go a little bit safer sometimes.
Now, Charlie, you mentioned marketing as one of the disciplines that is really useful for founders. Now, one of the other facets that I've not heard before, but is something you do on a day-to-day and have done for years, is research. User research isn't something that I've ever really considered or done, and I don't think a lot of founders do, but you think it is something that should be considered more. Why is that, and how do people get started?
Yeah, I kind of think that people mostly just think of research, it's the sense of validating a product, but there's really just like a lot more to it than that. But I just think that research generally should be put on the same pedestal as building and marketing. People always talk about marketing week and building week as if like those are the only two things that matter. But like you should think about doing good research as just as important. That can be from just making sure it's really easy for people to provide feedback or book a call with you. You should be speaking to, at a minimum, one user every week. There's this really good book called Continuous Discovery Habits, and the backbone of continuous discovery is that you're speaking to one user a week, and it doesn't even need to be on anything specific. It can just be asking about what their experience is, because things change in the market. You should, for example, all sorts of things can happen. Obviously, something like being in a lockdown is a huge change to like customer behavior, or coming out of a lockdown, or WeWork's just gone up. Like there's all sorts of things that can happen that you may not expect. And it can change people's behavior and how they're thinking about the product, or something might have broken that you're not aware of. So it's important to just continuously speak to people. So yeah, I just think founders need to put it on a bit more of a pedestal than they currently are.
Do you really think it's equivalent to building and marketing, where people associate those days or weeks for them, that you can also do that for research?
I'm not necessarily saying, you need to do a research week and a marketing week and a building week separately, but more like research should just be like completely ingrained in a lot of things you do. So it's just about having the research way of thinking throughout a lot of things you do, because it's hard to estimate this, but a common chart that I see is that it's 100 times the effort to change things in development than at the design stage. And that becomes more true the more complex and large your product gets. That difference gets bigger and bigger. Is it possible to do too much research? Yes, of course. If you're doing usability testing with more than 5 people, then you're wasting your time most of the time. And some things are reversible, so it's not worth testing. It's a lot of effort to research and test things. But you want to be doing just enough to make sure you're building good products and doing effective marketing that's continuously improving.
Charlie, you just said something that made me chuckle. So you said you can do too much research. I also believe you can do too much building, but I don't think you can do too much marketing. I think that is the one thing you could just do over and over, and it would have a positive impact on your business.
Yes, as long as it doesn't come at the expense of, some of the other stuff. But yeah, that's probably the one thing that it's least bad to do too much of.
Well, Charlie, you've been a great guest. I end every episode on 3 recommendations. Now, you're on episode 1, where your recommendations were Influence as the book, The Knowledge Project as the podcast, and Will Klopp as the indie hacker. Hit me with 3 new recommendations.
A book, $100 Million Offers by Alex Hormozi. Podcast, I like to listen to Lex Friedman's podcast. I think it's good to kind of take your head out the weeds of day-to-day sort of tactical bootstrapping podcasts sometimes. Finally, Indie Hacker. So our good friend Elston Barreto, who runs TinyHost.
Charlie, great recommendations. Thank you so much coming back on this episode 100 of Indie Bites.
It's an honor to be on number 1 and 100. Maybe I could be on 200 as well.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Indie Bites with Charlie from Ramen Club. If you enjoyed that and want to hear more, a reminder, the full extended conversation where Charlie and I debate the effectiveness of AI, among other things, is available on the Indie Bites membership that you can get access to at indiebites.com/membership. And a thank you again to my awesome sponsor, Email Octopus. That's all from me. See you next week.